What's your true life story that nobody will believe? Story 1. My biological father was a substance dealer, specifically coca, and my mother was one of his clients who began a relationship with him in exchange for substances, which led to her becoming pregnant and attempting an abortion that failed. And that is how I came into the world. From a very young age, roughly between the ages of 4 and 6, my father subjected me to repeated and extreme abuse, and later made the decision to exploit me further by involving me in a network where I was abused by other men and recorded, with those recordings being sold. I was never sent to kindergarten, and my existence went largely unnoticed until Child Protective Services intervened when I was 7 years old and realized something was seriously wrong, at which point I was supposed to be placed with my grandparents. During the transfer process from my mother to extended family, I was abducted, taken across the country, and hidden in an attic for approximately 1 week before being found. My uncle hired a private investigator who was able to track me down and locate me, and multiple Amber Alerts had been issued during that time. My extended family did not even know I existed until Child Protective Services and law enforcement contacted them. When I was finally found, it was discovered that at 7 years old I weighed 38 pounds and was severely malnourished, with major developmental delays such as not knowing how to read, tie my shoes, or even use silverware, as I had never used it before and did not know what a fork was. I was essentially a child who had never truly existed until that moment. A long court battle followed, and I was placed with my grandparents, whom I had never met before, where my life began to improve, and I lived with them until I was 15. I now live with my uncle and his husband, who legally adopted me when I turned 18, and today I am a healthy and happy teenager, studying pre-medical courses while also working as a veterinary technician. I was never supposed to survive, but I did, and because of how normal my life looks now, most people do not believe how extreme my past truly was. Story 2, I have had numerous encounters with wild animals approaching me at random moments with absolutely no fear. While I was in college, I often walked through a wooded area between my dorm and the football field where I parked my car, and one day I stopped in a clearing overlooking the field where the track team was practicing, since my roommate was a vaulter. As I leaned against a tree, I felt a gentle nudge and realized a fawn had come up and was sniffing my bag, and I stood completely still while noticing the mother deer standing just a few feet away. Very slowly, I reached into my purse, causing the baby to hop away. Then I placed the apple I had been carrying on the ground and walked off carefully. When I passed through the woods again, later that afternoon, the apple was still there, but had bites taken out of it. I have also been hiking and had squirrels and rabbits approach me without hesitation, and birds will land near me and refuse to fly away. It is a strange and wonderful experience, but because it only happens when I am alone, I never tell anyone about it, and it feels like my own quiet secret, as if I might actually be Snow White. Story 3. I met a man online and fell deeply in love, and after being together for around 5 months, we started making plans to meet in person. But before that could happen, he told me his sister had been killed in a car accident, which put everything on hold and caused him to slowly pull away. Around that same time, I traveled to Baton Rouge with the Red Cross after Hurricane Katrina, and while I was there, I discovered that I had been catfished. In a moment of anger and poor judgment, I spent a couple of days with another man I knew online as a form of emotional revenge, only to realize he was completely unpleasant. When I returned home, I confronted my catfisher and learned there had been no accident, his sister was alive, and the story had been an attempt to delay meeting out of fear. Eventually, I forgave him, flew across the country to meet him, and fell in love all over again in person, moving there a few months later, where everything felt perfect and happy for about a year. Then he relocated for work, and even though I loved where we lived and had a great job, I followed him, only for him to come to my apartment 3 weeks later in tears and confess that he was entering an arranged marriage that very weekend. 36 hours later, I watched him board a plane, and I have never seen him again, and tomorrow marks his 7th wedding anniversary. Story 4. Just after I turned 19, I was arrested and charged with an armed robbery that I was completely innocent of, and I ended up spending 10 months in jail, 6 of which were spent in solitary confinement under SUIC watch. I had spent my birthday at a resort hotel with my girlfriend at the time, And later that night, around 3 in the morning, the front desk was robbed by two masked individuals, one reportedly carrying a firearm and the other a knife. When we left the hotel at 11 in the morning, we were questioned because we roughly matched a vague height and weight description. Later that same day, it was discovered that my girlfriend had unknowingly used an invalid credit card to pay for the room, and we were both publicly arrested on a sidewalk, placed in handcuffs, and taken to the state police barracks without being told what we were being charged with. We were separated and questioned for hours, repeatedly asked the same questions about the robbery. She was jailed for the credit card issue, while I was released but instructed to return the next day for further questioning. When I did, I was placed in a back room and interrogated relentlessly by two detectives who picked apart every statement I made, suggested fabricated connections, and implied that my girlfriend had committed the robbery and that I would be charged alongside her unless I cooperated. At 19 years old, terrified and inexperienced, I believed them and nearly gave a false confession after being threatened with a 10-year sentence if I did not comply. 10 days later, officers arrived at my home and arrested me for armed robbery after my girlfriend had been coerced into giving a statement implicating me. I was immediately placed in solitary confinement on constant SUIC watch while waiting for a public defender. And when she finally arrived and I told her I was innocent, she initially dismissed me until realizing I was telling the truth, but informed me that my girlfriend's statement left me with no defense. The hopelessness and isolation eventually led to a severe mental breakdown several months into my confinement. The district attorney periodically visited, offering plea deals of 2 to 5 years in exchange for a confession or threatening 10 years if I fought the charges. But I refused to admit to something I did not do. 6 months after my arrest, still in solitary, I was abruptly taken to the police barracks, where the district attorney admitted they had determined I was not present at the crime scene, but stated they could not release me without charges because it would look bad, and instead offered to drop everything in exchange for a lesser charge that would result in my release within 6 months. After a heated exchange and consultation with my lawyer, I agreed and ultimately served 10 months total. Months after my release, my girlfriend and I were contacted by the mother of the man who actually committed the robbery, who told us her son had confessed to her, explaining he had been fired from the resort 3 days prior and knew exactly how to carry out the crime. She went to the police and was turned away, and despite trying desperately to find legal help, we were unsuccessful. The district attorney was later investigated in an unrelated case for intimidation and abuse of power, which remains the only sense of justice I have ever received from the ordeal. Story 5. I was in Mexico well past my visa allowance, which only permitted 90 days, but I had been there for roughly 6 months when this happened, and I was also working illegally at the time, with my uniform stored in my trunk. While driving, I passed a police car too quickly and was pulled over, and during the routine license and registration check, the officers asked for my visa. I told them it was at my home nearby and asked if I could retrieve it, hoping to gain time to figure out what to do, but they asked if it would even be valid, and I admitted it was expired. They explained I would be taken to jail and deported, while another officer searched my car and found my work uniform, leading them to question whether I was working illegally as well. The situation escalated with vague threats about harsh treatment until I realized they assumed I was American, and when I clarified that I was Canadian, everything instantly changed. Suddenly they were friendly, asking curious questions about Canada, and after a long conversation, they apologized but said they had already called the situation in and needed to take me to the station. As we were preparing to leave, a radio call came through, and one officer rushed back, urgently telling me to get into my car, follow them, and not attempt to leave as they sped down the road at extreme speed. A few minutes later, a car bomb had exploded near a restaurant, injuring multiple people, and we arrived at the scene where I was told to wait in my vehicle while they responded. After about 20 minutes, one officer returned my license, told me to go home, warned me not to get caught again, and advised me to return to Canada as soon as possible. Despite that warning, I stayed in Mexico for another 8 months before finally leaving. Story 6. When I was a child, I was declared a divine gift by the monks of St. Catherine's Monastery in Egypt, a place built around what is believed to be the burning bush from the book of Exodus. At the time, I was very interested in religion, so I asked the monks questions about the bush and whether the monastery held any other important relics. And after that, the monks fell completely silent and asked my family and me to follow them to the gates of the burning bush. They allowed us to see what they said were the remnants of the bush, even though we were not Orthodox Christians, explaining that this privilege was normally reserved only for high-ranking officials within the Orthodox Church, and that we were the first secular visitors they had ever allowed to see it. Afterward, they performed a special blessing for me, declared me a divine gift, and gave me a silver ring with Greek writing engraved on it. Because I was young, I did not fully understand the significance of the moment and reacted calmly, but my mother, who is deeply religious, was stunned for days afterward. Now that I am older, I sometimes wonder whether this was something they occasionally do as a symbolic gesture, or if they genuinely believed there was something special about me. Story 7. My cousin and I, both boys around 12 years old, were doing what many boys that age do and climbing things we probably should not have been climbing. And one day we decided to climb onto the roof of a house. Getting up was easy, and we spent some time sitting there talking about how impressive we felt for conquering what seemed like a massive house. But getting down required us to drop, hang, and carefully place our feet onto a railing on the back porch. My cousin went first and made it down perfectly, which gave me a lot of confidence, so I followed, scooting to the edge, grabbing the roof, and dropping to hang, only to realize my grip was much weaker than I thought. I lost my hold and landed straddling the railing, then instinctively rolled to my right to fall onto the deck where I planned to curl up in pain, but I did not notice the grill nearby and hit my head on it on the way down. I ended up at the hospital because I was badly bruised and needed to be examined to make sure there was no serious injury. And although the experience was embarrassing at the time, there were no lasting effects, and I can laugh about it now. Story 8. This did not happen to me, but to my grandmother, who about 25 years ago wanted to immigrate to the United States from Thailand. To speed up the process of obtaining permanent residency, she needed to marry an American citizen, and at the time she was divorced and spoke very limited English. So a friend introduced her to an American man who was secretly gay and already in a relationship. She paid him an initial amount of money, and they entered into a marriage purely on paper, went through the legal process, and eventually my grandmother received her residency status. She was supposed to pay him the remainder of the agreed amount shortly afterward, but only a few days after she received her documentation, the man was suddenly killed during a violent incident. The police contacted my grandmother to inform her of her husband's death and told her she should notify his family, which forced her to call his parents, who had no idea she even existed, and explained that their son had married a woman from Thailand and had passed away. My grandmother has lived in the United States ever since, and she never ended up paying him the rest of the money. Story 9. When I was 4 years old, around 1992 to 1993, my mother, father, sister, brother, and I were traveling back from South Dakota, and because we could not find a hotel the night before, we slept in our Aerostar minivan, which left my parents extremely exhausted. The next day, my mom was driving on the interstate and began to fall asleep at the wheel, crossed over the rumble strips on the left side of the road, woke up suddenly, overcorrected to the right, and the van turned sideways before flipping and rolling at approximately 65 miles per hour. Right before the accident, my siblings and I had been given permission to switch seats so my dad could read to me from the passenger seat while I sat in the middle row behind him, and none of us had buckled our seatbelts again. During the rolling, the back seat somehow flew out of the rear of the van, with my brother and sister still in it. I remember what happened before the crash, but nothing during it, and apparently I somehow ended up in my dad's lap in the front passenger seat, where he held me until the van finally stopped upside down on the road. Both of my parents were still buckled in, and my dad was holding me while hanging upside down. After which he unbuckled himself, climbed out, and left me with a woman who had stopped to help before returning to free my mom, who is paraplegic and still strapped in. While helping her, he could not find my brother or sister, and when my mom realized they were missing, she panicked and demanded to know where they were, only for my dad to look down the road and see them walking toward us. They had landed off to the side of the road, with my brother suffering only a scrape on his nose and some bruises from landing in the grass, while my sister landed on the pavement and suffered severe road rash on her arm and shoulder, along with glass embedded in her wounds from going through a window. My parents and I escaped with minor scrapes and bruises, and we were all rushed to the hospital where everyone ultimately recovered. Though my sister had it the worst, and I still remember her screaming as doctors removed glass from her injuries and later performed surgery to repair torn tendons in her wrist. In the end, we were incredibly lucky to survive, and we have often speculated that if my brother and sister had been buckled in, the outcome might have been even worse since they would have been strapped to the seat that was ejected from the vehicle. And even now when I tell this story, people rarely believe it unless my parents confirm it and my sister shows them the scars. Story 10. I was camping, and after unpacking all our gear and setting everything up, we placed a large bag of snacks, like chips and granola bars, on the picnic table, only to have a group of raccoons steal the entire bag while we were not paying attention. Later that night, we were drinking and relaxing around the campfire, fairly intoxicated and surrounded by darkness, when we heard rustling sounds coming from behind us near the picnic table where our cooler was. I grabbed my flashlight and rushed toward the table, intending to scare off a raccoon, deliberately keeping the light off to surprise it. But when I pointed the flashlight and turned it on, I realized it was not a raccoon at all, but a bear standing on its hind legs with the cooler open and digging through it. The bear looked at me briefly, reached back into the cooler, grabbed our pack of hamburgers, and began to run away. And in what felt like the most logical decision to my intoxicated mind, I chased after the bear, yelling for it to give our hamburgers back. Somehow I startled it enough that it dropped the hamburgers and ran into the forest, and we ate those hamburgers the next day, which tasted like absolute victory. Almost no one believes this story when I tell it, but my wife and two of my friends were there and witnessed the entire thing. Story 11. This story is strange because not only do other people not believe it, aside from the witnesses, but I barely believe it myself, even though I am the one who lived through it. When I was 20 years old, I went to Cuba with 3 girlfriends, and being a young guy on vacation, the first thing I did was start drinking heavily, especially since there was a bar inside the pool, where I would swim up, drink, swim around, and repeat until I was completely overwhelmed. I ended up extremely intoxicated on the first day and woke up groggy the next morning with no memory of what happened later that night. As I walked down toward the pool and buffet area, I was suddenly met with a round of applause from people around me, which left me completely confused, especially when staff members were praising me and treating me like some kind of hero. I found my friends already eating, and before I could ask what was going on, one of them jumped up, hugged me, and started crying, which only added to my confusion, so I asked what had happened. They told me that the night before, the girl who hugged me had been semi-intoxicated and fell into the pool after dark when the lifeguard was no longer on duty, and because she was not a strong swimmer, she began sinking while others nearby failed to notice what was happening. After roughly a minute, during which she nearly lost consciousness, I apparently jumped in, pulled her out of the water, and performed emergency resuscitation until she came around, something I have absolutely no memory of doing. Story 12. When I was 19 years old, I traveled to China as part of a study abroad program, but was told to leave when my visa was revoked due to the SARS outbreak, and not fully understanding visas or infectious disease at the time, I decided to stay anyway, which turned out to be one of the most intense experiences of my life. For 8 weeks, I walked from village to village in the foothills of the Himalayas near Tibet and the border of Burma, traveling through areas so remote that many people there had never seen foreigners before, alongside a few other college students who were just as young and inexperienced as I was. I slept in chicken coops, schoolhouses, and abandoned sheds, hitchhiked between settlements, and even helped slaughter a goat and a chicken for food, while meeting people who had never worn shoes and wore clothing made from bark. I crossed a gorge more than 100 feet above a raging river on a bridge made entirely of vines, ate fish heads with rice, and visited a river valley that had only gained road access the year before. We planned to hike out through a mountain pass, but heavy snow blocked it, forcing us to return the way we came, only to discover the sole road out was impassable because the tunnel through the mountain had been destroyed during construction. We managed to convince the construction crew to let us pass through the site, and on the other side, the Chinese workers welcomed us as guests, played music with us, sang songs we barely knew, and I ended up sleeping in a toolbox that had been converted into a makeshift bed. Story 13. I work at a lumber yard that sells nearly everything needed to build a house, including delivery services using pickup trucks, dump trucks, and forklift trucks. And one day I was delivering plywood and siding to a new home under construction in an already developed neighborhood. After arriving, I unstrapped the load and began carrying sheets into the garage. And after removing only a few pieces, I noticed people beginning to gather around the truck, which struck me as strange but not immediately concerning. As I continued unloading, the crowd grew to around 15 people, and I eventually stopped, staring at them, while wondering if I was about to be confronted or attacked, even pulling out my phone to call my boss just in case. Only then did I realize they were simply neighbors, including older residents, parents, and children, standing around out of curiosity in what was clearly a very quiet neighborhood. I shrugged it off and went back to work, and suddenly I heard them chanting "Lumberyard Guy" over and over, cheering me on as I finished unloading the truck. Completely stunned, I finished the job to applause, drove back to the store, and later found that my boss and friends did not believe a word of the story, even though the whole experience felt absolutely surreal to me. Story 14. After my divorce, my ex-wife moved 3 hours away with our sons, and for about a year afterward, the boys alternated spending 2 weeks with me and 2 weeks with her, and since I lived in a beach town, they spent nearly every afternoon in the water when they were with me. My younger son was around 2.5 years old at the time and was completely fearless, often running straight into the waves and getting knocked over repeatedly, which kept me constantly on edge. One night while the boys were at their mother's house, about 10 days since I had last seen them, I had an intensely vivid and terrifying dream about my younger son running into the ocean and being pulled out to sea while I tried desperately to reach him, only to be restrained by people telling me he was gone and that I would drown too. I woke up suddenly, panicked and struggling to breathe, shaken by how real it felt. And moments later, around 3 in the morning, my phone lit up with a message from their mother saying that something strange had just happened and that our son had suddenly sat up in bed and vomited a large amount of water, but seemed completely fine afterward. Story 15. It is not exactly an over-the-top story, but it is deeply meaningful and bittersweet for me, and it inspired me to write a screenplay based on it. One night last year, after a very turbulent breakup, my ex and I met to talk things through and try to make peace. And at first she was angry while I was irrational and emotionally overwhelmed. We met at the beach, and after about half an hour, the tension slowly softened, and we started being friendly with each other again. That night turned into 14 straight hours together, walking endlessly, talking about life and how badly we had messed things up, watching the tide at 3 in the morning, sitting inside a harbor master's office discussing everything, and even running away from bars to avoid friends who would have been confused seeing us together. At some point, we decided we would stay awake to watch the sunrise, because during our relationship, we had made so many promises we never kept, and this felt like one we could finally honor. It was hard, and at one point we nearly fell asleep sitting on those benches meant for trying on shoes in a supermarket, but we pushed through and watched the sunrise together. Looking back now, it feels like we were chasing that sunrise because we were still holding on to each other, unable to fully let go, even though we both knew this would be the last time. We never kissed or slept together that night, but we held hands and connected more deeply than we ever had during the relationship. And walking away from her that morning, knowing it was truly over, was one of the hardest things I have ever done. I wrote a screenplay about that night called Chasing Promises, and I hope that one day I will be able to make it because it really was a special night. We do not talk anymore, and as far as I know, we are not on good terms, but I still hold on to that memory, and somewhere, somehow, I hope she does too, though sometimes I wonder if I am still just chasing those promises, especially since when we first met that night, she told me, "I cannot stay long, so say what you need to say." Story 16. My story is long, and I have been told many times that I must be making it up for attention because it sounds so unbelievable. But this is what actually happened. In year 6, which would be grade 5 to 6 for Americans, our school got a replacement principal who openly claimed not to believe in mental illness and targeted me relentlessly because I have selective mutism, while other girls in my class joined in bullying me until I began skipping entire weeks of school just to avoid it. She locked me in dark closets, knowing I was terrified of the dark, and decided that because I avoided school, I had to attend a so-called morning club that started at 5 in the morning, meaning I had to wake up at 5 every day and be taken there until I had supposedly behaved, a situation that lasted somewhere between 2 and 4 months. During this time, I started comfort eating and went from 90 pounds at 5 feet 2 inches tall to 180 pounds, which only made the bullying worse because she openly insulted overweight students. And although primary school exams did not matter, I failed them and skipped the final day of school, thinking it was finally over. It was not. When I moved to secondary school, she had already labeled me as a troublemaker and instructed staff not to place me with anyone from my previous school, leaving me isolated among complete strangers, unable to make friends, while my old friends abandoned me entirely. The worst incident happened during gym class, which I dreaded because of my weight gain, so I skipped school every Tuesday, until my mother finally wrote a doctor's note saying I could not participate and advised me not to bring my gym bag to avoid carrying extra weight. When I handed in the note alongside another student with a broken arm, the teachers returned, accepted her excuse, and then erupted at me for not having my gym kit, shouting until my selective mutism kicked in and I physically could not speak, which only made things worse as everyone stared. I was forced into old muddy clothes that did not fit and shoes that were far too small, left alone to change while crying, interrupted while trying to call my mother, and then made to run laps in front of classmates who laughed before being told to pair up and being ignored, even by my former best friend. I never returned after that day, and the teacher later claimed I had been given a choice and even paid witnesses to stay silent, while the school contacted social services because they believed my mother had killed me and buried me in the garden. I was officially homeschooled for 4 years, but in reality I was left alone all day, barely leaving the house and playing online games, which only reinforced rumors that I was dead. Last year, I finally returned to education through college to complete my secondary studies. I received my results on the 21st of August, and I have since lost between 50 and 60 pounds of the weight I gained, slowly rebuilding my life. Story 17. About 10 years ago, I managed to lock my keys and wallet inside my car while the engine was still running, about an hour's drive from where I lived, at a gas station in the middle of nowhere. I called my wife from the station, but she could not come get me because we had a newborn at home and a 2-year-old as well, and I had no one else to call. I was sitting on the ground next to my car when a man suddenly drove up and parked right beside me, which was extremely strange because I was parked near a phone booth and not close to the gas pumps. I am very shy and rarely talk to strangers, but this man got out of his car and immediately started talking to me. He seemed a bit odd, so I told him I was not in a good mood, explained that my keys were locked in the car, and said he should probably move on unless he happened to have a coat hanger. He said he did not, but continued talking anyway, and at one point commented that I had a nice car, which struck me as strange since it was a 10-year-old Ford Escort. He then mentioned that his wife had the same model, paused, and suddenly checked his pockets to see if he had her keys, which he did. He suggested trying her key in my lock, explaining that sometimes keys work on cars of the same model, and unbelievably, he unlocked my door on the first try. I thanked him, and he immediately got back in his car and drove off. And to this day, I still do not understand why he parked next to me in the first place, since he never got gas. Story 18. It all began in high school when I was dating a girl I met during my sophomore year, and our relationship quickly became one where we were each other's entire world, partly because we both had traumatic childhoods and found comfort in someone who understood. We became far too close, far too intense, with constant breakups, emotional manipulation, and frequent verbal fights until it finally ended after she cheated and I realized I could not handle the chaos anymore. Things escalated after I moved on and started seeing someone new, which seemed to push her over the edge. As I would regularly see her car leaving my street, recognize her license plate, find scratches on my car, and receive threats accusing me of terrible things. She began harassing my new partner, throwing eggs at my car, and constantly trying to intimidate me, and I assumed that ignoring it would make it stop. Then the night before I turned 19, I left my new partner's house like any normal evening, went to sleep, and woke up to find out that her house had caught fire overnight. Her family barely escaped, and although everyone survived, investigators determined the fire had started in the garage and was intentional, explaining that such incidents are rarely random and asking who might have had a motive. My ex was the only possible person, and while I initially dismissed the idea as impossible, I later learned she had obtained my partner's address from a birthday invitation years earlier and had spoken about the fire in a way that felt disturbingly smug. Nothing was ever proven. The investigation eventually ended, and she never caused further trouble, but it remains one of those situations where logic offers no closure and instinct refuses to let it go. And even now, despite sometimes laughing about it, it is unsettling to remember. Story 19. I have what I jokingly call the ability to be a baby whisperer, which is a strangely useless talent since I do not particularly care for children, yet they respond to me in ways that surprise everyone. Years ago, I dated a woman whose sister had a young child, and although I assumed he was simply well-behaved, I later learned that he only behaved that way around me, to the point where I became one of his earliest memories, and he continued asking about me long after I was no longer around. I thought it was odd but harmless until my most recent relationship, when I noticed the same pattern repeating itself. My partner had a baby who would only listen to me, calming down instantly, sleeping, eating, playing, trusting me completely, and responding to me within seconds after hours of crying with others. I watched the child make huge developmental leaps, from language to coordination, simply through time spent together. And by the time she was just under 20 months old, her doctor was visibly surprised at her 18-month checkup by how advanced she was, holding conversations with me, counting, keeping rhythm, and following instructions. Since then, I have noticed the same thing with other children who are difficult for everyone else, yet open up to me easily, behave naturally, and even ask about me afterward. It does not really benefit my life in any practical way, but sometimes I cannot help feeling that such a rare ability to connect with babies and small children must exist for some reason, even if I do not yet understand what that reason is. Story 20. One of the first times I ever drank too much. I woke up late at night in the middle of an empty field and tried to sit up, only to realize I could not because something felt attached to my head, and when I reached back I discovered that all the hair on my entire head had been braided together with the hair of another girl I barely knew. Completely confused, I had to wake her up, awkwardly explain what had happened, and together we carefully untangled ourselves before going home. And to this day, I have no idea who did that to us or why. Another time, I snuck into a massive concert in New York City featuring two of the biggest rock bands in the world that year by hiding behind an amplifier and slipping through a road crew entrance, ending up watching the Black Keys and the Foo Fighters from the front row for free, standing near several celebrities, with no one ever realizing I did not have a proper pass. On a different occasion, my parents left me home alone with two friends for a weekend, assuming their parents would be around, while their parents assumed mine would be, leaving us with two empty houses and $100 for groceries, which we instead spent on inflatable boats. Using plastic shovels as paddles, we attempted to cross an isolated bay to reach another friend's house, only for a lightning storm to hit midway through, making the situation extremely dangerous. And since we were already too far out to turn back, we pushed forward against the current and somehow made it to the dock, later learning the storm was connected to a major hurricane down the coast. Years earlier, when I was a child, I had developed an unusual interest in books by the neurologist Oliver Sacks, and when I asked a librarian if they had anything by him, she began to scold me for interrupting the man in front of me, who turned around and said he had just donated a bag full of books, all written by Oliver Sacks, and handed them to me, a coincidence that still feels strangely impossible. Story 21. 2 weeks after my 27th birthday, I nearly died, starting with what felt like mild heartburn while I was at work, followed by an unusual ache along my jaw. And when I swallowed, I suddenly felt a popping sensation near my heart, after which every heartbeat felt like searing pain. I went into the bathroom as the pain intensified, unable to sit still or catch my breath, and called a friend who drove me to the emergency room. They performed a chest X-ray and told me I was not having a heart attack, did nothing further despite my obvious distress, and sent me home saying they were unsure what was wrong. Too weak and confused to argue, I went home and became violently ill, barely sleeping and constantly getting worse, until I returned to the emergency room a few days later, where doctors discovered my oxygen level had dropped to 48%, immediately alarming them. By that point, I was so weak that I had aspirated and developed pneumonia, and a computed tomography scan revealed that I had a leaking aneurysm in my aorta, which explained the intense pain. I was airlifted to another hospital with doctors telling my mother to prepare to call family because I might not survive. And to make matters worse, the flight passed through a severe storm that was so turbulent the crew struggled to detect my pulse, terrifying her, though she was allowed to accompany me due to the distance. In the end, I survived a condition typically seen in men over 60 years old, not a healthy, active 27-year-old woman. And what still amazes me is that on my birthday I had joked about feeling old, only for life to prove just how fragile it really is. Story 22. For obvious reasons, I am using a throwaway account because my entire family has been involved in organized crime for as long as I can remember, spanning a large region of the United States. And growing up, I always sensed something was off. My father was killed 3 months after I was born, betrayed by someone he trusted, and from that moment on, my life was shaped by secrets I was too young to fully understand. As I grew older, I noticed we always had money despite no one holding normal jobs, that many of my so-called uncles were not actually related to me, and that people in my family would suddenly disappear or move away without explanation. When I was about 8 years old, I even witnessed a violent confrontation between adults that left a lasting impression on me, though everyone continued to insist our family was normal. By the time I was 16, I was no longer willing to accept the silence, and my family finally explained the truth, that their income came from illegal operations like trafficking and loan lending, and that two men I had grown up calling uncles were highly experienced enforcers. After learning everything, I was gradually pulled into the logistical side of the family operations, starting small but eventually overseeing much of it, as the responsibility had been passed down through generations. First to my grandparents, then to my father, and after his death, to me. I am now 22 years old. The family continues to operate smoothly, and I have never spoken about this to anyone before, choosing to release the weight of it anonymously, knowing I will likely disappear again once I have finally said my piece. Story 23. I grew up with extremely abusive parents, and it was so bad that I am honestly lucky I had both of them, because at times one would stop the other before things became fatal. Anything more than pancakes for dinner felt like a luxury, and when I was 10 years old, I was diagnosed with epilepsy, which only made everything harder. A few years later, I was drinking heavily and skipping more school than I was attending, until one day I decided I wanted more from life than what was possible in that environment. I left home at 16 and moved 300 miles away to a place where I knew no one, so I could try to rebuild my life. I stopped drinking, worked for a year, enrolled in school, and eventually graduated high school. After that, at 19, I moved across the country with a boyfriend I had been with for 3 years, only for that relationship to end soon after, and 3 years later I married his coworker. That marriage did not last long because we were best friends who confused comfort for something more, but we remained close friends, still having lunch together on Tuesdays and playing video games on Wednesday evenings. After the marriage ended, I went to college and eventually built a stable life, and now I live with my boyfriend of 4 years, who helped me realize just how broken I had been without ever knowing it. My family is still deeply unstable, so I limit contact as much as possible, especially since my mother and sisters currently have a restraining order against my father after he spiraled 3 years ago, while I remain physically safe in another province. I speak to my mother about once a week, though it is emotionally exhausting because she constantly tries to play the victim and bring up my father, ignoring the fact that there were times he had me on the floor kicking my ribs while she did nothing. Despite all of this, I have a great job where I am paid about $12,000 more than expected. I have chosen to live a child-free life, and while it took years to stop flinching when someone reached toward me, I have finally found peace and stability, which is something I never thought would be possible. Story 24. When I was around 24 years old, I was drinking at a small local bar when the owner caught an underage patron, around 18 or 19, drinking inside. The owner physically threw him out, repeatedly putting him on the ground before returning inside, while the intoxicated kid stayed outside with a friend, smoking and loudly vowing revenge. Curious and uneasy, I stayed outside to see what would happen, and when the kid suddenly marched to his truck with a determined look, his friend desperately trying to stop him, I knew something was wrong. He returned holding a handgun, and since the bar was small with no one working the door, my intoxicated self instinctively stepped between him and the entrance, started talking to him, offered him a cigarette, and slowly tried to calm him down. Somehow, after what felt like an eternity, I convinced him to hand me the gun, nodded to his friend to restrain him, slipped back into the bar, locked both entrances, warned everyone inside, and called the police. By the time officers arrived, the kid was gone. And while the people there knew what happened, no one in my life now would ever believe that drunk me may have prevented a tragedy. Story 25. For reasons I still cannot fully explain, I decided to take the bus across town one weekend to visit an Asian market to buy a birthday gift for a Thai coworker. Even though I had slept in, nearly stayed home, and genuinely did not need to get her anything at all. Suddenly I felt compelled to get dressed and catch the next bus. And as I rushed out the door, a clear thought in my own voice crossed my mind, saying that I would meet a man on the bus, which made me laugh out loud as I told myself I absolutely did not want to meet a man on a bus. I boarded anyway, and at one of the stops, a close friend from college whom I had not seen in 12 years got on, and I spent the entire ride staring at him in disbelief because he had once been one of my best friends and had completely vanished from my life in the 1990s. We got off at the same transit center, reconnected, and during our conversation, he mentioned his lease was ending. So I offered him my couch since I had just ended an engagement and owed him kindness from years earlier when he had helped me escape an abusive relationship. A week later, he called and asked to meet at a bar, where I discovered he had just fled rehabilitation, had become a chronic alcoholic, and had been homeless for years, something I was entirely unprepared for when I agreed to help him. Over the next 2 years, he stayed with me on and off between repeated attempts at treatment, draining me emotionally and leaving me bitter, disillusioned, and questioning why I had felt so strongly compelled to take that bus in the first place. I gained nothing from the experience except exhaustion and a loss of empathy, and he gained little as well, leaving me to wonder why that inner voice led me towards something painful instead of something good, or at least something that made sense. Story 26. This is the story of how I broke both my knees during the summer after third grade, and it honestly plays out like something from a children's movie. I lived on a tiny one-way street, and further up from my house there was a massive oak tree with a branch that stretched all the way across the street. There was a boy on the block, who we will call Tommy, and he was the classic antagonist type, always telling me I could not do things because I was a girl, even though I was the biggest tomboy around. One day he dared me to climb the tree, so I climbed the huge oak and he followed me up. I made it to the branch that crossed the street, and he crowded me from behind until I was forced onto it, then started pushing so he could sit too, edging me further out over the road while the branch began to wobble. I panicked, and instead of stopping, Tommy started rocking back and forth and even bouncing on the branch, which made it shake even more. I lost my balance and fell straight out of the tree, landing knees first on the hood of a car, driven by a poor man who was obeying the 15-mile-per-hour speed limit and definitely did not expect a 9-year-old to fall out of the sky in front of him. I ended up in the hospital. Tommy's parents paid part of the medical bills, and I spent the rest of the summer in the first semester of the school year in 2 full leg casts and a wheelchair. Strangely enough, I still had an amazing summer, got used as a battering ram in several epic games, and somehow earned enough respect from Tommy that we actually became friends afterward. Story 27. When I was 16, I got heavily into smoking weed and was buying it from a guy at my school until one day he approached me with a knife and claimed I owed him around $600, which I knew was impossible because I had a terrible job, was terrified of debt, and would never have agreed to take that much without paying up front. I refused, told him I would never take 60 grams without paying, and he warned me to watch myself the next time I saw him. About 2 weeks later, during summer break when I did not see him often, he and several of his friends came after me, and although I tried to run, they caught up, forcing me to fight. This is the part people struggle to believe, because at 16 I was not a small kid at all. Standing around 6 feet 3 inches tall and weighing about 270 pounds with relatively little body fat, strong but not fast, and I knew how to fight. I ended up fighting all three of his friends hand to hand, knocking two of them down by slamming them into a wall and hitting the third hard enough that he stayed down, at which point the dealer realized his friends could not handle me and pulled the knife. Knowing I could not fight someone armed, I ran again, made it nearly around the block, and then heard scraping, footsteps, something solid hitting a head, and a shouted curse. I turned around to see one of my close friends, who happened to be skateboarding past, had seen what was happening and smashed the dealer in the back of the head with his skateboard, knocking him unconscious and ending the whole situation. Story 28. I was at a party having a really rough time after just breaking up with my girlfriend when, out of nowhere, the most attractive girl at my brother's school came up to me and asked what was wrong. I said nothing at first, but she kept pressing, and eventually we started talking. She shared something to smoke with me, even though I did not really do that at the time, and we ended up just talking for the entire night. I remember thinking that I would probably have done anything she asked because I was completely taken by her, and I even swore to my friends that one day I would make her my girlfriend. 3 years went by and I never saw her again, until the first day of training at a new job, when a friendly and really cute girl I met during orientation warned me not to hook up with a certain coworker who happened to share the same name as the girl I had once vowed to date. I laughed it off as a coincidence, since the name was fairly common, but as I was leaving orientation, I saw her walking in, and we just stared at each other in shock because it had been 3 years. The general manager introduced us and asked if we had met before, and I tried to break the tension with a joke by saying, "Unfortunately," which I meant playfully, but the look of sadness on her face instantly made me regret it, so I apologized and said I was kidding. A couple of months later, we started dating, and while things were good at first, I soon realized she had been through extreme trauma, including abuse within her own family, and eventually she cheated on me. I ended things, but later found myself in a messy situation where she cheated on another partner with me, which finally made me realize I needed to walk away completely. Not long after, the girl from work who had originally warned me, who I will call Sarah, started spending time with me, told me she and the other girl had once been best friends, and described her as a compulsive liar, which rang true, and eventually Sarah and I began dating. We were together for almost 5 months. She told me she loved me very quickly, and even talked about having children. But one night when we were supposed to watch a meteor shower together, she disappeared and stopped answering her phone. On my way home alone around 2 in the morning, I saw her walking with another guy I knew, and when I later confronted her, she denied everything, tried to guilt me, and accused me of being unreasonable for seeing that situation as a red flag. We broke up shortly after, and later a mutual friend told me that Sarah and the first girl were essentially the same person in different forms. Former best friends who had turned on each other after getting involved with the same people, and I just happened to be the last one caught in the cycle as everything around them started to fall apart. Story 29. My life has felt like a long string of bad luck repeating itself over and over again. When I was around 2 years old, my father lost his job and developed a severe addiction to crack coca, and he was largely absent from my life until I was around 14 or 15 when he finally got clean. I grew up in a poor neighborhood where people regularly tried to sell me substances. I got robbed, and I got beaten up often enough that it felt normal. My mother worked as a bartender for most of those years, and when she was at work, I was left with a babysitter named Mary, who was addicted to hero and would lock herself in the bathroom to use while completely ignoring me. And I even remember being in the car with her on multiple occasions when she suddenly tried to flee from the police. My mother cycled through a series of men, most of whom were emotionally abusive toward me, but we depended on them financially. So I learned early that standing up for myself could mean ending up homeless. When I was 11, my mother became pregnant by a man who disappeared, and she developed a condition where her pelvic bones were separating, leaving her in constant pain and requiring frequent hospital visits, which effectively ended my childhood as I became responsible for helping care for her. When my brother was born, I became his primary caretaker whenever she worked, essentially acting as a surrogate father by the age of 12. In 8th grade, I moved in with my father to try to build a relationship with him, leaving my mother behind with a boyfriend I hated, something I still feel guilty about. And while I had a few more stable years, my stepmother treated me poorly and openly favored her biological child, which fueled anger issues I still struggle with today. Just before my junior year, my mother suffered a heart attack and was diagnosed with diabetes and multiple cancers, along with a degenerative condition that was later identified as post-polio syndrome, which led me to move back to live with her, abandoning my friends and starting over in a new place. Within a month, my girlfriend broke up with me, and for the next 2 years, I went to school with almost no friends, worked to help pay bills, and relied heavily on online friendships to survive emotionally while living in an environment surrounded by addiction and violence. My mother eventually lost her job after illegal financial decisions made out of desperation. We were evicted, and we ended up living with an abusive neighbor where I slept in the kitchen while my sick mother slept on the couch. She underwent major surgeries and survived cancer, but her pain never stopped, and she developed a serious gambling problem that drained what little money we had, while frequently telling me she wanted to end her life and reacting with rage if anyone suggested she stop. I dropped out of college to work, took on financial responsibilities I could not legally prove, was audited by the tax authorities as a teenager, and ended up in debt that I am still carrying. Over the years, utilities were placed in my name and sent to collections without my knowledge. Family members cycled through jail, and I became increasingly depressed, angry, and numb, to the point where I knew I would not survive unless I escaped. I moved back in with my father, worked to save money, and eventually moved into a house with friends where I have lived for 3 years, which has been the most stable period of my life. Yet I still struggle with anger, heavy drinking, financial insecurity, and the feeling that no matter how hard I work or how well I perform academically, I cannot gain real footing. I am starting therapy soon, but I still do not know whether my pain comes from my circumstances or something deeper. And some days, the loneliness and exhaustion make life feel unbearably heavy. Story 30. When I was in 8th grade, I found out that I had an older brother who was in the same grade as me, and even at the same school, but no one would tell me who he was. So I started treating everyone as if they might be my brother because I wanted us to already be friends by the time we were allowed to know. This went on for about 2 years, during which I had plenty of nights where I cried myself to sleep wondering who he was. And then during my sophomore year of high school, I finally got my dad to tell me, learning that he was my half-brother on my father's side from before my dad settled down. It turned out the guy was already one of my closest friends, which felt unreal, but my mother told me it was not my place to tell him the truth, so I kept pretending I did not know and continued hanging out at his house like we always had, even though his mother knew the entire time that we were brothers. I decided I would not say anything until Christmas of senior year, but instead his mother chose to wait until 3 weeks before graduation to finally tell him that I was his brother, which felt cruel considering how close we were to such a major milestone. He called me the night he found out, and even though I missed the call, I knew exactly what it was about as soon as I saw it the next morning. At first, nothing seemed too different, and we hung out a bit more, but it still felt like we were just friends instead of brothers. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized how much life had been taken from both of us by the adults who kept the secret. He might not have spent years with a verbally abusive guardian who was never truly his father, and I could have grown up with the brother I had been wishing for since I was 7 years old. Story 31. When I was 17 years old, I was held at gunpoint by the president of my high school alumni association, and it all started because my friends and I were playing a free-range game of Nerf Assassin. I had a Nerf gun painted black and was hanging out at a friend's house in a slightly rough area of town when I got word from a mole on the other team that they were sending people after me. So we decided to leave. As we walked outside late at night, a black sport utility vehicle started creeping up behind us, then sped up, which sent us running through backyards, jumping a wrought iron fence, and tearing my hoodie while trying to get back to my car, only to realize it was already being watched. We hid in an alley while motion lights kept turning on, waited for our squad leader, and moved to the pickup point. But moments later, a man jumped out of a car, saw my black Nerf gun, pulled out a real firearm, and told us we were not going anywhere. He sat us down on a porch with the weapon pointed at us and explained that an alarm at his wife's dance studio had gone off, which I realized was the building right behind us. While my friends argued that he could not detain us, the gun made that argument pointless, and once we convinced him we were teenagers playing a game, he calmed down and started asking questions. That is when it got surreal, because he found out we went to his old high school, revealed he was the president of the Alumni Association, knew our squad leader's parents, and had even gone to grammar school with my aunt. He eventually let us go on good terms, but the night was still not over, because we were later trapped in a locked car by the opposing Nerf team for nearly 45 more minutes until both squad leaders finally agreed to call a 12-hour truce. Story 32. When I was 16 years old, I was rabbit hunting with some friends in Ramona, California, while another friend was riding a small mini bike around the property. As he came down the road toward the wooded area where we were, my friend and I had the terrible idea to hide, jump out, scare him, and shoot at him with pellet guns while aiming low, which in hindsight was an incredibly stupid decision. I hit him in the leg and the pellet entered but did not exit, causing him to fall off the mini bike, and as we rushed over to help him, the bike drifted into the nearby brush. While tending to his wound, one of us looked up and saw the mini bike on fire along with the surrounding vegetation. And since it was July in East San Diego during a drought on a 95-degree day, the fire spread almost instantly. We ran to the house to wake everyone and call emergency services, leaving our injured friend behind because he could not walk. And once people were evacuating, we ran back toward the woods to find him, only to see flames climbing more than 60 feet high into the trees and our friend nowhere in sight. I genuinely believed I had caused my friend's death, and we were escorted off the property by police and interviewed from a safe distance. Thankfully, the house was spared, the land eventually flourished after the fire, and although 150 acres burned, no homes were damaged. Fire authorities later attempted to bill me $248,000 for negligence, but lawyers were involved and everyone was ultimately cleared, though the experience was absolutely terrifying for a 16-year-old. Story 33. 4 years ago, I was in Atlanta attending Dragon Con, underage and desperate to drink and party, so my boyfriend and I came up with the incredibly bad idea to pay a homeless man to buy us alcohol using my boyfriend's debit card. While waiting outside the liquor store, the man was kicked out by the owner and told us he knew another place. So we followed him, one block turning into several until we suddenly realized we were far from the convention and walking along Martin Luther King Boulevard late at night. We got scared and tried to head back, but the man refused to give the card back. And just as I started panicking, a police officer appeared and began questioning why we were in such a dangerous area. While we were focused on coming up with an explanation that did not involve underage drinking, we failed to notice the man casually walking away with the card. And once I spotted him a couple of blocks down, I took off running without saying a word. I caught up to him, tackled him to the ground, and he handed the card back, claiming he had forgotten he was holding it. Moments later, the officer and my boyfriend arrived in the patrol car. The officer yelled at me to get in, and after I admitted everything, he gave us a serious lecture before dropping us back at the convention. We ended up drinking with friendly strangers afterward, but no one believed the story when I told it. Story 34. When I was in the Army, during my first deployment, within my first week in country, I was involved in a brutal and chaotic near ambush during an exfiltration from a small kill team operation, and we took multiple casualties during the firefight. I was hit by shrapnel from an explosive round in my right thigh, but I was still able to move on my own and make it back to base, where a medic removed the fragment with tweezers, gave me antibiotics, and asked if I wanted him to file the paperwork for a Purple Heart.